Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Ferguson. I'm the Dean of Libraries at Murray State University. You should see on this slide my name and my email address. If for some reason you need to reach out to me outside of the Zoom chat here or the Zoom screen here. So, oh my gosh, Chloe from London. So we've got folks overseas as well. This is an international event. I'm excited. So again, my name is Chris Ferguson. I am Zooming with you today from Murray, Kentucky, which is the home of Murray State University. I have put on this opening slide, ooh, excellent. Chat should be enabled now. So you might be able to join via chat, it looks like. I am both presenting and monitoring chat right now. So this is going to seem maybe a little frenetic as I move back and forth. I have posted the links to the Charleston hubs and the Charleston conferences, social media links, as well as a hashtag that if you want to comment about today's sessions on social media, there's a hashtag for you to use. To tell you a little bit about the Charleston in-betweens is the idea was to have Charleston is a big event and lots of people come, but we wanted folks to have perhaps some smaller venues where they could connect on very specific topics. And that is why the in-betweens were created. This is not the first. We had one back in the spring, and I think there was one in 2002. We've done some on other topics before, but they are meant to be sort of a deep dive into a particular topic. You can, so now that we've got chat, you can put your comments. An anonymous attendee has said that they can't see what people type in the Q&A. Can you all see what's happening in chat? It looks like a couple of people have responded, but it looks like okay, good. So I'm going to encourage you, now that we have chat enabled, to put your Q&As, your questions in the chat screen. That way your folks around you can also see the questions you're asking and chime into those. And that will let me focus on just watching the chat. Okay. So please put any comments, questions you have in chat, and I will be monitoring that as the day goes on. Just a brief reminder that tomorrow the start time is 11 a.m. Eastern, not 10 a.m. All of our sessions are being recorded. We have been recording these awkward interactions since the moment we logged in. So everything's being recorded and will be posted to the Charleston Conference YouTube channel sometime after the conference. I don't know exactly what the turnaround time on that will be, but these will be made freely available down the road. If you are here with a group, so if you registered as a group and you are in a room with more than one person, I would ask that you email me. Again, my number's on the screen. You email me the number of people that are joining your group. That will help us have an idea of exactly how many people are participating, separate from the number of Zoom logins. Okay. Thanks. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. So we have two sponsors for this event, IOP Publishing and Pre-Review, and we want to thank them for their support. We would not be able to do this session without them. So this morning, in just a few minutes, hopefully right at 10:15 Eastern, I'm on Central Time Zone, so I'm going to be getting confused all day, but at 10:15 Eastern, I'm going to turn this over to Brian Nosek, who we are thrilled to have join us this morning. And then we will follow that up with a stakeholder panel and then take a lunch break at noon. I do want to remind everyone that's here about the Charleston Conference Code of Conduct. We respect free speech, and we ask that everybody here treat their fellow participants and the speakers with respect and consideration. We want to keep this environment free of discrimination, harassment, and would ask everybody to maintain professional and ethical conduct. Okay, at this point, I would like to introduce Brian Nosek before I turn this over to him. I'd like to introduce Brian. Oh, I opened the wrong. I have the wrong file open on my computer. This is okay. I found the one that has Brian's bio. Okay, so Brian Nosek is executive director of the Center for Open Science and a professor at the University of Virginia. He received his undergraduate degree in psychology with minors in computer science and women's studies from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and his PhD in psychology from Yale. Nosek co-founded 3 nonprofit organizations: Project Implicit, to advance research and education about implicit bias; the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, to improve the research culture in his home discipline; and the Center for Open Science, to improve rigor, transparency, integrity, and reproducibility across research disciplines. So today, Brian has come to us and is going to chat with us a little bit about how his research and his work it has applied to peer review. All right, so at this point, everybody thank Brian for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Brian, you should be able to share your screen.
Great, I'll do my best. Thank you for having me at this event, and thanks everybody for joining. This is a topic that is of central importance to the work that we do at the Center for Open Science, and that many actors are doing in trying to deal with a very rapidly changing landscape that challenges the credibility and trustworthiness of the research enterprise. And peer review, as we know, plays a central role in maintaining the integrity and trustworthiness of research. What I'd like to do today is sort of a meta commentary about some of the innovations that have been occurring over the last several years in peer review, and offering a perspective on how those changes ought to continue to change and innovate in order to address some of the fundamental challenges that face the credibility and trustworthiness of the literature. So to begin with the conclusion, what I want to contrast is the old model of peer review as gatekeeper to getting the reward that scholars need, meaning that publication is the currency of advancement in research. I get advanced by publishing frequently and publishing in places that are notable and respected in order to have a job, in order to keep a job, in order to advance in my career. And contrast that with a new model that has been emerging in fits and starts that treats peer review as the reward and de-emphasizes the publication or published as an outcome of being the basis of that reward. And the argument that I'll make is that this shift has fundamental impact on addressing challenges of credibility for what researchers themselves do in terms of their decision-making about how it is they conduct their research rigorously and credibly, and can fundamentally change some of the broader challenges of dysfunctional or untrustworthy actors in the ecosystem of publishing that seek to take advantage of the reward system as it currently exists, with the focus on publication as the unit of advancement. So let me unpack this context by focusing on the components of a few components of the old model as I'm simplifying a characterization of it. Peer review as a gatekeeper to reward. In the old model, as an author, I conduct my research, I write up the paper, I submit it to the journal of my choice for review. If it manages to get past peer review and into publication, I get my the reward that I need. I get a publication, I put it on my CV, and I go on to try to do the next work. Some key elements of that are that the peer review process itself is opaque in the old model. Nobody that's looking at my now published paper knows how it got from origin to publication. They just know that that happened. Some process behind the scenes assessed the qualities, the trustworthiness, the credibility of that paper, and decided to publish it. That review process occurred at a particular glimpse in time of the research life cycle. After I've completed my work, and now that I think that I'm ready to share it with others, and it assessed the qualities of that research at that moment, rather than any other point in the research life cycle. The decision process is a dichotomous one. The journal decided to accept it or reject it, ultimately. And it's that dichotomous outcome that leads to the finality of the reward. Now that it's published, it is forevermore published, with very, very few exceptions of retractions happening on occasion or corrections occurring to try to qualify what was claimed, but often not being easily linked to that original work. So in that simplified old model context, my paper gets a credibility stamp of one, published, and the second of where it's published. That might add some additional sense of the qualities of my paper. And the basis of that peer review process that happened behind the scenes in that moment in time and made that decision and made it as a final decision, all transfers from the fact that it's now published and where it's published, transfers its reputational status to my paper as now a legitimate item in the scholarly record. The core challenge with that old model is that many of the things that we identify as dysfunctional practices, as dysfunctional markets in the system can leverage this old model and make money with untrustworthy practices. Predatory journals leverage the fact that just published as a signal is sufficient for many people to get the rewards that they need of the demands of their employer, of their national environment, etc. Paper mills can take advantage of the signal of, oh, I'm an author, is all the signal, the heuristic that's needed in order for me to get the rewards that I need consequently. The emergence of AI papers, just getting them to published is sufficient to get enough reward of this. And then the other practices of researchers that are doing research in some way, but are taking advantage of what it takes to get to publication or what it takes to get into more respected outlets that might change the credibility of their research while simultaneously increasing the publishability. So the real challenge with all of those is that doing trustworthy research is hard work, but untrustworthy research uses the superficial signals of having done the hard work without actually doing it. And so if we can address some of the gap between what it is that's actually happening behind the scenes in peer review process and otherwise, then we might start to address the ability to distinguish more effectively and then discourage those untrustworthy research practices. So I want to unpack that by contrasting those simplified old model characteristics with new model characteristics that challenge those dysfunctional practices in the environment. So for example, instead of the process being opaque, if it is entirely transparent, that can have some impact on the likelihood of those dysfunctional practices of having success. If instead of peer review happening at a single point in time, after the research is done, before it is shared with others, if it's instead considered as an evaluation that occurs across the life cycle of that evidence, of its claims, from the origin of the ideas through its interrogation in the marketplace of ideas once it's shared with others, that challenges some of those dysfunctional practices. If instead of a dichotomous decision, a singular decision to decide, is this scholarly research or not, published or not, we instead change to a marketplace of indicators of many different aspects of the qualities of that work. Instead of taking that complex, qualitative, intensive peer review process and digesting it into yes or no, but exposing that and then even innovating on it, we challenge many of the dysfunctional practices that occur leveraging that dichotomous decision. And then finally, if we don't embrace finality of a particular paper as existing as it exists forevermore, but instead recognize that, like scholarly knowledge itself, literature can be versioned, that it can be updated over time to take into account observation of error, making of corrections, insights that challenge that work, then we provide additional challenges to those dysfunctional practices. So let me unpack these piece by piece to sort of provide some context, some ideas of how it is that changing these will affect, in a positive way, both the actions of individual researchers trying to advance their scholarship and their careers, and the marketplace of untrustworthy actors trying to take advantage of researchers' goals. So transparency, for example, at its fundamental level in this context is to make the bad practices more inconvenient to do and more detectable when they are done. So, for example, it is increasingly common for journals to show some transparency of that otherwise opaque peer review process that occurred behind the scenes. For example, the simple actions of showing when the paper was submitted and when it was accepted. The time gap is identified by others as, is that a reasonable time gap for a peer review process to have occurred? It's a low signal, but it's some kind of signal. Likewise, naming the editor for each article accepted provides some degree of transparency of there was a person who made a decision, and this is who the person was that made that decision. More assertive, progressive actions on creating transparency in the peer review process are to show the actual reviews themselves and attaching those to the paper. Or even more progressive is, in fact, naming the reviewers so that there is a person attached to that review content for how it is they did assessment. Each of these types of actions creates inconvenience for actors like predatory journals who now have more content that they need to generate. That is because they don't actually do the work to conduct the peer review. The entire goal is to superficially, with as little work as possible, provide the signal that the authors need to create a market without then putting the expense in to actually having to do all of the things that earn that credibility signal. So as the norms shift towards transparency of the peer review process, being itself the signal of credibility, being itself attached to the reward, here are the reviews that I received, here are the comments that I received, then we create more and more barriers for those dysfunctional practices to have impact on making decisions. Second example is life cycle and versioning combined to make the bad practices more inconvenient and detectable. So in the old model, the simple process is the review and revision process happens at that glimpse in time, and then ultimately the paper is produced. In a life cycle embraced model, more of that, the conducting of the research from the origins of the ideas through the planning and then through the actual work, then the reporting, and then even revisions after the fact, create opportunities to surface that work is being done, whereas in the fraudulent models, the work isn't being done. So by exposing earlier stages of the life cycle, of making that part of the process, sharing plans, sharing data, sharing code, all of the guts of the research, and then even engaging review in different stages of that, like the registered reports model, creates inconvenience for fraudulent actions, for other behaviors that, again, attempt to demonstrate superficially that those things have occurred without actually having to generate the content. And then likewise, to the extent that surfacing that review content along the way provides occasions for the review itself to be a signal of credibility. It's not just the publication at one point in time in the process. It is the interaction of me as an author with the scholarly community in developing these ideas and interrogating what they will demonstrate, and providing the scholarly dialogue that occurs in the marketplace of ideas more broadly, but now focused in on this particular scholarship, on this particular project. And surfacing that then creates a different way, a much broader way to conceive of how is it that this author is making scholarly contributions to the literature. The fraudulent actors then have to create other types of content to try to keep up with the surfacing of this life cycle as it happens. And the great advantage here of thinking both in terms of transparency and the life cycle is that this work is already happening. It's not asking authors to now do new things like collect data. They are collecting data. By making it transparent, then it surfaces work that they have been doing that otherwise is invisible, and makes it easy to distinguish their visible work against the fraudulent work, the predatory work, the other types of practices where it's not actually happening. So they don't have the opportunity to make it visible. It's not that they couldn't then start to do practices that invent data, but it's hard to invent data that's fraudulent. And over time, the more and more of the life cycle that one makes visible, the more and more work it requires to do it fraudulently. And so at some point, it's just sort of like, well, why don't I just collect the damn data, since this is such a pain in the butt to try to fake it? And so we make the actual content of the actual doing of the research about the same difficulty as the attempts to fraudulently say that I did the research, by making more of it visible and open. The third category, marketplace. We can move from thinking about peer review as a dichotomous assessment, it's in or it's out, and substantially broaden the way in which we signal, is this work trustworthy? Should we take this scholarship seriously? Because that's really the goal of the review evaluation process. Is this worth taking seriously? And there are a variety of components that contribute to the trustworthiness of research. And each of those offer potential indicators. And as we diversify that set of indicators and make them visible to readers, it just turns what is otherwise a real easy and pointed target of attack, making it just a simple, superficial signal of here's a publication, into a very difficult one for authors themselves to fake, and then the predatory players to fake, of, oh, there's lots of different evaluative characteristics here. How am I going to produce this in a way that addresses all of those things? So just to call out some examples of each of these components of trustworthiness that could be converted into indicators, I want to show them in the context of thinking about research in terms of the life cycle of generating those original ideas, of planning and conducting the work, to writing it up and publishing it, and then the discussions that occur afterwards. Because each of those components of accountability are more or less of an emphasis at different stages of the life cycle. And if we broaden our conception of how a publication is helping to surface the life cycle rather than just a point in time, it provides a means of thinking about surfacing many more indicators of evaluation, so that the article becomes a gateway for the reader to see and understand and evaluate the content of that work. And then that evaluation content and all of its diversity become a reward itself for the authors doing it. So I'm showing you here each of the components of evaluation, those 7 categories, and I kind of put in orange where in the life cycle it's most relevant at present. And then in the middle here, showing a few different indicators that exist at present or can be innovated on to provide more and more information that are signaled by credible outlets and credible review processes. So the obvious, simple starting one: has the research been assessed at all? Did peer review occur? Has someone reproduced the findings, reanalyzed the data to see if the results that are reported in the paper are associated with the data that is shared with it? Are the findings robust to different analytic strategies? Has someone else replicated it? All of those are opportunities to surface indicators of trustworthiness of that work. When we talk about calibration, do the claims that the authors are making match the evidence that they provided? There are lots of signals that authors can provide that we can surface more readily about the content and quality of that research. To what extent do they represent uncertainty in their findings? To what extent do they identify the limitations of that work? Talk about alternative explanations. Really lay out the constraints on generality. We did this in Ohio. We don't know if it happens on the West Coast of the US in the same way. And to what extent are the conclusions themselves aligned with the evidence? Can the research be assessed as a precondition to being evaluated? What is it that the people doing the evaluation can actually evaluate to determine its trustworthiness? When we just have my paper for you to read, you're reading through my lens of what I thought was worth reporting, how I thought I should report it, and what it is I characterize my work as having done. But if you're able to see the plans that I had made, the data that I had generated, the materials that were responsible for the process of generating that data, the code that I applied to that data, all of that is the actual research that helps readers understand better in context whether my characterization in the paper corresponds with the work as it actually occurred. And the more that we make that visible, the more inconvenient we make doing that work fraudulently or doing things that undermine the credibility of the work, make it harder to do, and then make it a lot easier to detect when it does occur. Is the research well formulated? Does it take into account relevant knowledge and perspectives? Indicators like, does it review the relevant literature? Is it informed by existing theories that have strong expectations about how things work in this particular area of practice? Is it representative of and generalizable to the population of interest? They do it over here, but the claims apply over there. And then fundamentals of good research practice. Does the research control bias? Can we surface more visibly whether the measures that were used are validated, whether the researchers blinded themselves from being unconsciously influential on the results as they observed? Did they randomize when they said they randomized, and how did they randomize? Did they pre-register to clarify what was planned in advance versus what was unplanned? And the complement to that is, to what extent does the researcher promote precision and reliability of assessment? How well does it reduce the amount of error that's inherent in any research process? In quantitative domains, what was sample size used? How reliable are the measures? Did they conduct a power analysis? And then the last is, are researchers actually accountable to being trustworthy? Did it go through ethics review? Did they offer a conflict of interest statement or a positionality statement on factors of how it is they interact or the context in which they conduct that work? Do they disclose the funding sources and credit all the contributors to the work? All of these are illustrations of different types of indicators, many of which are already surfaced in articles, but not all. And many of them don't have rigorous indicators associated with them. And if we really think about pushing the boundaries of innovation on peer review, we don't have to limit it to peers in the human assessment per se, although many of these can be enhanced by some structured support of how peers assess. We can also think about automated methods of extracting some of this information from papers. There's a variety of different companies that have launched that are trying to use machine methods to extract insights about whether the data are shared, whether a COI statement appears, to make that stuff more visible, more readily. And there's machine and automated methods to consider other aspects of credibility. Just as one illustration, our organization, Center for Open Science, collaborated with several other groups on a program called SCORE, funded by DARPA, to try to develop algorithms that assess the credibility of findings in research papers. And we've just completed the phases of that DARPA-funded work and are writing up the papers. But this is just an illustration of what one of the algorithm teams surfaced as a way to show how the algorithms are scoring the content that it extracted from these papers, in giving it scores on a variety of different dimensions that could complement what the human assessments do that really do a deep dive into that work, and then might also complement some of the other objective indicators about the work, the sample size, the statistical inference values, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a dramatic amount of space in the marketplace of indicators that could help to not just improve the credibility of the research itself, but also address the credibility of the system of publication by making the poor actors harder, or the untrustworthy actors harder to succeed. So just to close out so that we can get to some Q&A if there is some time, the ideal of the new model is to confront the simple heuristic of it's published as a sufficient heuristic for getting the rewards that researchers need, and instead expand the conception so that it's actually making visible the real hard work that's occurring in conducting the research and evaluating the research, so that it's harder for those dysfunctional practices to succeed, because the last thing they want to do is hard work. The whole purpose of fraud is to avoid the hard work and instead just get the reward by doing something easy. The whole purpose of selective reporting and p-hacking is to avoid the challenge of, boy, this is a difficult question and I'm not quite sure, and we see it here, we don't see it there. Let's just simplify it because I know I'm right and report it this way. Predatory journals, paper mills, AI papers, all are avoiding work. So let's surface the work that is being done and innovate on that work to try to make it more feasible, more possible, more successful, to show the work that is underlying the basis, that is the basis of trustworthiness of that literature. So the action steps, I think, that are needed as a research community in advancing peer review as reward is, in the short term, just make the existing indicators more visible. There's lots of good innovations, especially that journals have been pursuing, to make visible a number of these different indicators, COI statements, editor, who is the editor, et cetera. The more that we just take the low-hanging fruit of making that stuff visible, the more we create the occasions to start to shift the policies and practices so that it's the indicators of trustworthiness, the actual evidence of trustworthiness, that starts to drive the reward for researchers, rather than the simple heuristic of, can someone say it's published or not, that masks all of that work done by legitimate sources. And then for the long term, the community of peer review, with a broader conception of who a peer is, can really continue to expand and experiment on how it is we can try to assess credibility and trustworthiness, so that we can extract more and more information, provide more useful signals to readers, and give authors that holistic way of demonstrating the value of their work, of their hard work, so that they get the rewards that they deserve. So to close, the concept of shifting our mindset of peer review from a gatekeeper to itself being the reward can help to expose the existing practices that are making research trustworthy, make those more visible rather than leveraging and relying on the superficial signal of we accepted it for publication. It reduces the capability of dysfunctional markets like fake papers and predatory journals to thrive. And it simultaneously increases the emphasis on rigor and quality of the research. And that's a real win-win. So thanks, everybody, for coming, for your time. I'll be delighted if there's some time for discussion and questions to address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. We appreciate that. We do have a question. I'm going to pull up the chat. So Lisa Hinchliff has asked, so what is the benefit to the researchers who have more to do in this new model to make the various stages transparent? There are collective benefits, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but what are the benefits to the individuals? And then there's a second part of that question, but I'll let you answer the first piece.
Yeah, it's a great question because without the collective efforts to change, individual researchers who say, I'm going to do all the extra work to make my data available, my code available, everything else, add extra work without any extra reward. So the ideal context, and we're seeing this shift happening at present. So this is not in theory, it's already occurring in a variety of fields and will accelerate with the OSTP memo that is shifting in the US context to requirements for greater sharing of data and code and materials underlying the basis of research. What we're seeing is that researchers recognize good practice. So yeah, you're not rewarded directly for sharing data right now, but you are rewarded indirectly because other researchers in every survey that's conducted on this recognize people that are transparent with their data are more credible. I trust them more. I think more seriously about their work. And so that is rapidly shifting the norms within scholarly communities because people are recognizing that, yeah, it isn't relevant for getting the publication, but it is relevant for getting the reputation, and that matters. But there's a limiting influence there. If it's just reputation and never changes the criteria for publication, we will not get from here to there because researchers are obviously responsive to the direct incentives and rewards. So journals updating their policies to require more transparency of these practices, institutions integrating that transparency into decisions about hiring, tenure, and promotion, funders making it a condition of practice. Those are essential parts that complement the scholarly norms that are shifting as from bottom up of communities themselves embracing those changes. But the positive case is that all of that is occurring. We're not talking in the abstract. Changes are underway, and if I had them available, we look at every open science or transparency indicator that we have, it has a nonlinear growth function over the last 10 years. It is still a small portion of the overall literature, but it is an exponentially growing portion of that literature. And the policy changes afoot will just make that all the faster. So my hope is that we keep all of this stuff kind of shaped as well as we can so that everybody stays aligned. So good practice rather than just bureaucratic burden is the mental model we operate with. Great question. Thank you.
The other half of Lisa's question, and I think you've already touched on this a little bit, is how could institutions be incentivized to invest in support for this kind of additional work? And the OSTP memo, I think, addresses a little bit of that, but is it a reallocation of existing funds? Is it repurposing grant funds? How do we incentivize institutions to assist in this?
Yeah, no, that's also, important and critical for real functional change to occur here. Because if it's just a wink and a nod and go do it, it will not be done well if it is done at all. And moreover, the inequities that already exist in the allocation of resources across institutions, across individuals, across national contexts will just get exacerbated. Very large, well-funded labs will be able to implement these new demands because they've got resources to spare, and people who are doing their work on a nickel and dime are even more challenged to then participate in the scholarly process. And so institutional engagement is a critical part of that to be able to succeed. Now, the obvious incentive for research-oriented institutions are things like the OSTP memo and then the coming federal requirements that each federal funding agency will impose. And those are having that impact. I'm on the Open Scholarship Working Group Committee at the University of Virginia, and the institution is saying, these requirements are coming. How are we going to deal with this? Like, what do we need to do to support our researchers to do it? But is that conversation happening everywhere, especially in environments where those policy changes are occurring from funders? They're occurring with journals, but they don't have the same resources within the institution to help provide those supports. And that's where extra effort is going to be needed that doesn't just rely on the institution, but also on the community of scholarly services to make the solutions accessible and implementable in ways that don't add administrative burden without adding scholarly benefit. And that's really when those two things get out of whack, then we really create problems, especially in exacerbating inequities. If it's just administrative burden without scholarly benefit, then it's all about burden. If the benefits can be accrued, then we can maintain that emphasis on these are scholarly norms. It's hard work. Research is hard work. We're not going to get away from that. Let's just make clear that the work that we do is aligned with the rewards that we provide. And that's the key. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so there's another, this is sort of a comment, but I think it produces a question. So there was a comment that if publishers make these improvements, but it is easier for authors to publish elsewhere, the publisher could be hurt by adding in these extra requirements. So how, for example, if a commercial publisher says, okay, we want you to make your data available, and somebody can just go publish a preprint without that data on a freely available website, how do we diminish the impact on publishers?
Yeah, it's a great comment because it calls out that it's not just researchers themselves that are affected by the reward system. It's also the stakeholder agents, publishers and otherwise, that have their own incentives and reward systems to wrestle with. So one way to frame it is that this already exists. It's a lot easier to go to a predatory publisher and pay $500 to get my publication than to go to any of your journals and go through this peer review process where people are actually criticizing my work. And oh my God, it's a hair tearing out process. Why would I bother doing that? I'll pay $500, a lot easier. Why don't we all do that? We don't all do that because we already have some indicators of reputation among journals that are doing quality work, that we have some trust in, and others that we do not. And those signals matter. But we need to enhance those signals. And those signals will continue to matter by those journals that are doing the most highly reputable, highly trustworthy work will be the ones that gain the highest reputation. And so the payoff for publishers and specific journals is, do those actual index signals matter not just for the research, but also for the reputation of the journal? So we offer, for example, a service called Top Factor, which is scoring journals on transparency and openness promotion guidelines, which are 8 components of trying to maximize transparency of the research that they publish. Those, you can go to topfactor.org if you want to see those scores as they're laid out. And it's just intended to be a visibility of what are journal policies, and then some normative accountability of what are other journals in my field, what are they doing in terms of promoting transparency, and is my journal at those standards? more progressive than those standards, below those standards, or otherwise. So if we don't diversify, for example, beyond journal impact factor as a singular criterion for evaluating a journal, and fail to expand that set of indicators as mattering for the reputation of the journal too, then I think that the threat of that comment would come to surface a lot. So thank you for that. Oh, you're on mute still, Chris.
Sorry about that. So Heather Staines has a comment and then followed that up by a question. And actually, I'm going to read a comment before her. Is that Bill points out that another key issue to addressing the more work issue is that it has become much easier to share data and software than it was a few years ago. So the current state of our technology really is making it easier to undergo this kind of life cycle process and make that other data available.
That is, yeah, vitally important, is that the real effective scholarly service mindset is how do we enable people to do the good practices and simultaneously lower their burden. It's really easy to come up with solutions that just add more work. Okay, we have data sharing policy. What that means is when you're done with your work, you have to share your data. And then when that occurs in standard practice, okay, my paper's finally accepted, the data from that paper. Okay, well, actually, we collected that data 3 years ago. I haven't looked at that data for more than a year. The postdoc that was responsible for analyzing that data left my lab. They're in industry. This is going to take me weeks to go back and prepare that data so that it can be shared. Oh my God, that is a crazy burden. Instead, if I know that I'm going to be sharing data, because the policies are very clear, it's common practice, and I have scholarly services that support my management of the data as I'm using it, that make it so that I'm adding metadata while I'm analyzing it, just in time adding, so that it's actually being prepared for sharing at the point in time that I'm actually engaging the data. It will provide benefit to me, and it will reduce my burden of actually meeting that policy at the end. And so this is a place where the journal policies really need to be aligned with the funder policies, really need to be aligned with the institutional policies, because all of them help to support me as the researcher of recognizing that this is a shared policy. The policy landscape is leading to this. If it's all the journals all by themselves, then it's very hard to get me as the author to think about this from the onset of the work. So thanks. That's a very important call out.
Heather, who has turned on her camera, I'm going to let Heather, she put one in the chat, but I'm going to let her ask it in person.
It's double Chris Ferguson. This is crazy. Look at this.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, if I have to be anyone, I'd love to be Chris Ferguson. Thanks so much for that. I'm a historian before I came into publishing, and so I'm always trying to think, about the folks who might be more new to dealing with the concept that they have data and making that data available, and even talking to other historians who don't believe they have data. So how do we kind of expand the notions of transparency that will benefit tenure promotion, will benefit, peer review, credit, transparency and all of that beyond, maybe the usual suspects that have spreadsheets and different, lab samples and things like that?
Yeah, great question. I particularly liked the work. It's now, 2014 or 15, I think it was most active in political science, the DART initiative, data. Now I don't remember what the DART stood for, but it was a joining collaboration, because political science is one of these fields that has a very strong qualitative tradition, theory-based work, and an emerging quantitative tradition. And there's tensions in those communities about what good scholarship is, how to do good scholarship. And in the DART statement that came out, DA-RT statement, I'm sure it'll come up in Google, they came to common ground understanding between different research traditions and epistemologies and everything else on what they mean when they say we want to try to promote data accessibility, data transparency. And it was great to be I was a very minor, I was sort of at the meeting saying, wow, this is such a great discussion, because they really challenged each other to understand a broader conception. So the concept, for example, of active citation in history or other types of qualitative or theory-driven work, of situating, here's something that I extracted from this reading, from this history, and here's the pathway for you to see that in the context of the original work that I interrogated for that particular argument that I was making. That, I think, has really been productive. And you're right that the quantitative side of this has gone way ahead, and partly because of the ease with which, I have my data set. It just came out of the machine. I can post it. That's easy. Concepts about how do we do active citation and other types of transparency of data in these more enriched interactive work with original sources will take more time. The other thing just to call out is the Qualitative Data Repository, QDR, at Syracuse is a very nice effort that's trying to advance some principles and practices there. Thank you for that.
All right, well, it is 9:58 and our next session is scheduled to begin at 10. So I'm going to stop taking questions at this point. I do want to thank everybody that did ask questions, and I especially appreciate one of the commenters, Brian, said that your keynote was worth the price of admission right off the bat. So if nothing else,
I hope it wasn't free.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start introducing. So again, many thanks to Brian for joining us today and for sharing his comments. The next up, we have a stakeholder perspectives discussion. So we have 3 different folks that approach peer review in their daily work, and they're going to talk about how their views on peer review, how they work with it, what they consider the strengths and areas of improvement to be. So first, we are going to have Joris van Rossum. Joris is Program Director of STM Solutions. And he leads various programs and projects with STM with a special focus on the STM Integrity Hub and AI. Joris chaired the NISO Committee on Peer Review Terminology and is going to speak today a little bit about the committee's work and goals. After Joris, we will have Kelly Smith, who is the Director of Collection to Discovery at Eastern Kentucky University. Kelly currently serves as co-chair of the Affordable Learning Steering Committee, an initiative of the Kentucky Virtual Library. And that committee facilitates efforts to expand availability of low and no cost, high quality education materials in the state of Kentucky. And then lastly, we have Courtney McAllister, who is the editor. She is an editor, an associate editor at Serials Review and the Serials Librarian. Her work focuses on publishing technologies and workflows, and she will be speaking this morning from the perspective of an editor of a scholarly journal. So thanks very much to Joris, Kelly, and Courtney for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to them. Joris, you should be able to share your screen. If you're not, let me know.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm trying to share my screen, but I see a different kind of interface. So I'm just trying to find the PowerPoint, and 1 second. There we go. This should be doing it. Yes, can you see my screen? Very good. That's a big relief. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. I was fascinated by the presentation that we just saw, Brian's. I hope he's still online, because it actually combines a lot of the work that I'm involved with STM. So STM, in case you don't know it, it's the Global Association of Scientific Technical Medical Publishers. We represent about 2/3 of all published articles come from publishers that are part of STM. So my work at STM Solutions is focused on a couple of areas. First, it's research integrity. And I think in the last presentation, we really saw how research integrity is related and connected to peer review, but also to a lot of potential signals we could expose to the community. I'm also involved with research data and leading the research data program, trying to enhance the opportunity for publishers to let authors share their research data alongside publication. And again, also a very big relevance here for research integrity. And last but not least, and that's what I'm going to focus on in my talk today, I've been leading the initiative to create a new terminology for peer review. And I will talk a bit about the reasons we did it, the motivations, but indeed research integrity is also a big part of it. So very happy to talk about peer review, and I think we can also perhaps then expand the discussion on research integrity, which is, I guess, one of the big items in our community at the moment. So there are two reasons why we started the initiative. So the peer review terminology. One is open science, and open science means also, it means a lot of things, but it also means transparency. So peer review has been a black box, as we saw in the previous presentation. It's an opaque process, and we have to open it up. Opening up doesn't mean necessarily only opening up the review process, because there's a wide variety of peer review models, and we believe that there are various areas, of course, and communities that might have their own need for specific peer review models. In any case, we have to be, and I'm talking about the publishers here, more transparent about the particular models that have been used on the journal level. So when you have an author that considers submitting a journal, an article, a manuscript to a particular journal, that author has to be well informed of what kind of review models are being used for the journal. But also, if you are a reader and you're accessing and reading an article, you have to have a feeling on what kind of review model has been applied to that particular article in order to trust, to increase the trust in that publication. So one reason why we did this project is openness and transparency. Another one is that peer review used to be a more or less straightforward and clear activity before, let's say, 20, 25 years ago. But then, of course, with the internet came and the movement towards open science, came open review. Now, an open review is not something that is very clear, well defined. As a matter of fact, this is a seminal article from Tony Ross Hellauer, who analyzed definitions of open peer review and came up with 122 different definitions. So that is a terminology that necessarily leads to confusion and unclarity, and also non-transparency. So the peer review terminology group started in 2019 in order to come up with a terminology of peer review. We used to call it the taxonomy. Now, in the end, we decided to call it terminology. So trying to come up with a way to describe the peer review models that is clear and that is universally applied in the community. And the community, I'm talking about journal articles specifically, but the intention is then to enlarge that to other objects as well. Second aspect of it, not only to come up with a standard and a widely applied terminology of peer review, but also to make sure that it's, as I started with, make sure it is communicated consistently in the scholarly ecosystem. So when somebody is reading or considering a journal, what kind of review models are being used when you're reading it, etc. Also, of course, towards the review community. So when a reviewer is reviewing a manuscript or is invited, that he or she is made immediately aware of what kind of review models are expected for that particular journal. So we started this initiative in 2020. We started with a working group organized by STM, mostly with journal editors. We had our first trials and pilots where various publishers adapted the terminology and tested it to their communities, to their editor communities. Then it became a NISO project a few years later. So we wanted to make this a NISO standard. Then also we increased the working group to a wider group of participants, with librarians, with scholars themselves. And this led to the peer review terminology that I will present to you today. It became a NISO standard in July. So it is now approved as a standard, and the next step, of course, is the rolling out, which will expected to take also some time, and I will end my presentation with that. So I will run you through that terminology today. Some remarks before that. So this is a terminology that is focused on journal articles. The intention, however, is it's also going to be used for other objects, research objects, books, for example, software. For that reason, we will continue the work of the working group to make sure that it is applicable to a wider group of objects as well. So, how does it look like? This is the terminology we came up with, and I will run you through the various steps one by one. And I will also end by explaining you how it's going to be used. So how will the terminology be used when describing a review model on the journal or on the article level? We start with, so you see what you see here is 4 columns, and it describes the elements which is used to describe a review model. And we try to incorporate the various models, the 122 models that were described. There might be review models that are exceptional and not and don't fit the model, but as we tested it and we piloted it, it is quite effective to describe most of the peer review models. So the first element is identity transparency, and that category describes the extent to which the participant in the review process, the identity are made visible. Of course, we know the traditional model whereby something we called single blind or single anonymized, as we call it. The review identity is not made visible to the author, but the author identity is visible to the reviewer. And again, we don't make a recommendation for this for any of the models. We understand that we need a diverse ecosystem of review models, but we have to be consistent in describing them. So single anonymized is what we used to call single blind. We also have double anonymized, where identities are both not visible. We also have triple anonymized. So this category, this part of the terminology describes the way to which identities in the process itself are revealed to the participants. We have also a category or an element in the terminology that describes who the reviewer interacts with. The traditional process, it is the reviewer that interacts with the editor. The reviewer receives a manuscript. The reviewer will describe a report, and that will be sent to the editor. The editor might ask some questions, etc. But of course, we have seen models whereby the reviewer interacts with other reviewers. So when a collaborative review is written, we also see models where the reviewer interacts with the authors themselves. So this category allows the publisher to describe who the reviewer interacts with. Again, traditionally, reviewer interacts with editor, but can be extended with reviewers and authors in other models. The third element describes on the information that is shared in the review process. Open review can also mean that the review reports are shared, or the identities are being shared. And this category allows the publisher to describe that. So a very traditional model, there is no information shared. It is an opaque process. can be, again, still useful in certain areas, but there are review models whereby the summaries of the review report are being published openly. The names, of course, the names of the reviewers, can have its advantages, certainly. Although, of course, we also see, and when I was working at Elsevier, we did a lot of experiments around open peer review, and some areas we at that time saw that making the names identity can also change the character of the review. So again, it is something that is very suitable for specific areas and might be less suitable for other ones. In any case, this category allows the publisher to describe that. In some cases, the review reports are published, but it's dependent on opt-in. So this is covered by this particular category. And then we have what we used to call post-publication review. Now, in order to, again, prevent confusion around it, and that is a large reason why we developed this, we call it post-publication commenting. There are two flavors here. There's an open one. Basically, everybody can comment on the article once it's published. We're not talking about commenting on third-party platforms like PubPeer, but it's on the article page itself, hosted by the publisher. And then we also acknowledge the post-publication commenting model, whereby the comments are made on invitation. So how does it work? Again, the review model is described using those 4 elements. So let's say a traditional review model, you see described here: identity, transparency, single anonymized, what we used to call single blinds. The reviewer interacts with the editor, and the review information published is none. Sometimes there are more models applicable to a journal, then we recommend also that to be written down. And the post-publication commenting, we recommend only to use that category when there is case of post-publication commenting. Of course, in 95% cases, I'm just making a guess here, there is no publication commenting. So this is the way it's going to be used. Again, where is this made visible? On the guide for authors, in instructions, on the review instruction page, but also on the article page. So our vision is that every article that will be published will have this summary describing the peer review model. So what are the next steps? Well, this was only the start. So we worked a couple of years on this. Very happy with the collaboration with NISO and all the members in the working group. I think I recognize some names that were on the working group. So again, thanks for that. Now it's up to the implementation, which is probably not going to be, well, it's not going to be a process of months, but it's going to be a process of years. The first step for us is to do it on journal level. Why? Because it is easier. It's on a very practical level, easier to change your guide for authors than it is to change the article page. But then later on, again, we want the system also to be adapted in such a way that that information flows into the article as well. And then we want to extend to other research objects. Again, I mentioned books, but there are also other objects such as software or data that can also be having these descriptions. So this was my hopefully not too long description of the peer review terminology. If you have any questions, please contact me. Also, you can find this information on the STM website. And I should say we have in the peer review week, we have a webinar on this terminology, including some of the people that are part of the working group, talking about the next steps more specifically. So thank you for now.
I put this in the chat, but we are going to let all 3 of our panelists speak, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. Thank you.
Am I next? I guess so. Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Yes. Okay, good. All right. Thanks so much. That was really interesting, Joris. So I am going to be wearing 2 hats today. as a librarian who has worked in the peer review space. And so I want to make sure I tailor this to people who are there. So I'm going to ask you a question. And if you could just type in the chat, have you ever served as a peer reviewer for a journal? Just yes or no, just to give me an idea. Okay. Looks like about 3/4 view. Oh, maybe about half and half. Okay, good. So I want to just share a little bit from my perspective serving as a peer reviewer. If you've never been one and you might be considering it, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So there are lots of benefits to being a peer reviewer. For me, what I have appreciated most is just early access to research, seeing what other colleagues are currently working on, and sort of stimulating my interests and my practice. So that's been super helpful for me. I see it as a way to contribute back to my scholarly community. It's rewarding in that way. Definitely, it's been a great networking experience for me. I'm currently on the board of Serials Review, and I've met a lot of really great librarians that way, and we meet up in person at conferences, and it's just, it's a great community and a vibrant networking option. Something you might not have considered is it's a good metacognitive thinking process. So reviewing papers kind of has forced me to articulate my thoughts clearly and provide constructive feedback for authors, and then think about how I can write better in my projects as well. And then, of course, it's good to add to your CV. So definitely, if you've never considered that as part of your portfolio practice, definitely I would encourage you to do that. So there are different ways to become a peer reviewer. There are often just calls, we need peer reviewers, so join us. If there's a journal that you like reading, you can go to the journal page and see they often have just rolling acceptances of peer reviewers, or just word of mouth. So it's definitely something that's possible for you, even if you're new to the field. It's a great way to give back to your community. And I just wanted to share, so the journal for which I'm a peer reviewer is a traditional journal published by Serials Review, which is Taylor and Francis. And so there's a whole peer review workflow that's sort of managed for me. It makes it easy to see things that I've done in the past. I'm ashamed to say that I logged into my portal and realized that I was supposed to review a paper last year and I never did it. And so it's sitting there in my pending, and there's like nothing I can do about that. But so definitely, like, if you're going to commit to reviewing a journal, don't do what I did and like drop that ball. So you do have to carve out time to be able to do this. Okay. The other good thing is, even if you don't think you have, maybe you don't even have a lot of experience writing your own papers. Your input is still valued because you're a practitioner and you can give feedback to the author. And so there's a lot of support that you're given, guidance in how to write peer review reports. So don't let that keep you from participating. Okay, so that's hat number one. Me working as a peer reviewer, highly recommend. The second hat I'm putting on is as the person who oversees our open scholarly publishing here at EKU. This has been a journey that started in 2010. For us, we use the bPress Digital Commons repository. And the thing that actually drew us to it was the fact that we would be able to publish journals and that it had journal publishing features built in. So we could offer that support to our faculty who were interested in publishing open journals. So this is just a snapshot of the back end of one of our journals, the Journal of Occupational Therapy Education. And so you can see the options that are in here. this is customizable depending on what authors for particular journals want. So, you know, as libraries, as universities, we have infrastructure in place to be able to support open journal publishing without asking for article contributions. This is our way of supporting scholarly communication. And so we have put funding into supporting it in this way. So the library pays for access to bePress Digital Commons, and we are able to support publishing in that way. Just another snapshot to give you an idea. This is, I took out the names, but so these are some articles that have very recently been submitted to this journal. They've all started going through the process. The editor has assigned reviewers, and it all happens within this dashboard, and it's pretty seamless and works really well for us. So for journals, our experience of peer review, it's not open, of peer review, traditional peer review, has been pretty straightforward. On the other hand, we've run into some issues of publishing open textbooks. We started publishing open textbooks in 2019. The first book we published was Slavery to Liberation, The African American Experience. And that was a project that our African American Studies department wanted to do together. So it was primarily faculty in the department, and then some submissions from other colleagues that they knew. Unfortunately, from the beginning, they didn't build in any kind of anonymous peer review process. So if, you know, you might be thinking that, oh, this could have caused some issues if colleagues were reviewing each other's works for publishing and giving each other maybe feedback that they didn't appreciate. So there was some sort of morale issues, I would say, with that. And so we learned from that definitely to encourage our faculty to either consider some kind of anonymous peer review or go towards open peer review. So the screenshot there on the right is from an open textbook that is currently being drafted openly. And so the faculty member is releasing chapters as they are written and inviting public comment and corrections and essentially open peer review. So we are still struggling in this space a little bit. We don't actually have a system for open textbooks. I can share that later, Yoris. I can show you. It's this particular one is on the Manifold platform, which has a peer review. Well, it's kind of like a reading group annotation, public annotation built in. But also a lot of other people, like Pressbooks has, oh, what's it called? I'm blanking on the name of it, the public annotation software that is built into that. And I can share some examples of that when I'm done talking. Hypothesis, thank you, that's it. Presentation brain freeze. So anyway, so in the open book publishing space, our authors didn't want to use the bePress workflow for that. Even the ones who put out calls for chapters didn't want to take the time to learn that software to do that because it was more of a one-time thing instead of ongoing. So I think traditional peer review options for OER might be a gap. If anybody in the audience knows of any solutions, I'd love to hear it. And I know that there's a panel on this tomorrow, so I'm curious to hear about that. Okay. In my slide deck, I have references. I'm going to share all the links in the chat. I wanted to be kind of quick today to give my other colleagues a lot of time to talk, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion during the Q&A.
Okay, wonderful. I think it's my turn for the screen share dance. Let's see how successful I am in that. All right, can folks see my slides? Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you to my fellow panelists. I've already taken copious notes, and this has been such a productive discussion even thus far. Today, I'm really excited to be talking to you about peer review from the perspective of a journal editor. I set these kind of talking points mainly for myself because I could just talk about peer review for a really, really long time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time and bandwidth. So I'm going to try to rein myself in. I want to talk about the context that I'm coming from and the publications that I've worked on, some of the challenges that we've seen related to peer review with those journals. Some of the strategies that we are employing currently to try to address those challenges, and then some future things we're looking for, looking to implement, or questions that we're asking ourselves, some of which are a little existential, I admit. Please share any questions, comments in the chat. This is a really complex topic. We've already covered some really critical and interesting areas, and I'm really excited to see where this conversation takes us. So my name is Courtney, and I worked in public and academic libraries for about 15 years. I'm currently a solution architect at Adipon, so my day job is more in the publishing technology part of the scholarly communications ecosystem. But I've retained my role as associate editor for both the Serials Librarian and Serials Review. And I did this very intentionally because I just have a real passion for library publishing. I feel like access to vetted, peer-reviewed, trustworthy content is just so critical for a profession where a lot of what you learn changes on a constant basis. And it is other practitioners that help you adapt to changes and figure out ways of being innovative. And I've benefited from the expertise of so many through journal articles before. And I'd like for others to have that opportunity as well. So that's kind of my background and why I'm still so committed to this part of the communication flow. My comments today, I don't feel are necessarily specific to the journals that I've been involved with, but I also don't want to claim universality. So I want to be transparent about my specific background. I've worked on the Serials Librarian and Serials Review as associate editor. These two journals are both published by Taylor and Francis. They're supported by the same editor-in-chief, Sharon Dias-Correa of Oxford University, myself in the associate editor role. And then just this year, we brought on two assistant editors, Meg Maring for Serials Librarian and Melissa Lockaby for Serials Review. We use double anonymized peer review. I'm giving myself sparkle points for the fact that I did not have to change that slide after Joris's comments. It already said double anonymized peer review, so huzzah. We surface green OA content. We surface a wide range of content types, from your traditional research article to columns, interviews. It's kind of an eclectic blend of content. For managing our peer review process and submissions, generally speaking, we have two different systems. Serials Review is on Editorial Manager and Serials Librarian is on Scholar One. So we do have portals that help us manage that flow, kind of similar to what Kelly was showing during her presentation. So when it comes to peer review, we've seen challenges in both of these journals, and some of them are long-standing and some of them are a bit newer or changing in some way. One of the kind of long-standing challenges has been variations in familiarity and comfort with serving as a peer reviewer. Some librarians are very savvy. You send them an invitation, they've served as a reviewer before, or they're coming to libraries from another academic background. They have doctoral degrees or other master's degrees, and the expectations of a peer reviewer are very clear and concrete for them. Others may not be as familiar with it. Performing a peer review is not something that is taught consistently in library information science curricula. So there's a bit of a knowledge gap that we need to be mindful of when we are generating content that's peer reviewed. A growing challenge, not a new one, but one that is growing, is limitations on peer reviewer bandwidth. I gave this the biggest bubble for a reason, because it is something that is a very significant challenge for us. We recognize that librarians have been overtaxed for a long, long time. You know, many librarians are doing the work of multiple positions, and there just aren't enough hours in the day. And that's not something that we're seeing decrease. I would say probably going in the opposite direction, unfortunately. What this means for us is that one, you know, we're trying not to burn out our reviewers, but two, it's taking longer for us to identify active reviewers who have the time and energy to look at a manuscript. So, you know, previously, maybe we would send out 5 invitations to get 2 yeses, and the manuscript could move forward with the review process. Now that's 20. And we are lucky. Other journals are spending more and more time trying to source reviewers who have the expertise and the availability in serving. So it's just something that affects other parts of this chain too. And I think maybe the bandwidth question is also tied to some structural changes, some macro level changes we're seeing in librarianship. You know, a couple decades ago, I think maybe there were more positions in libraries that were tenure track, which perhaps formalized the role of librarians in publishing as authors, as reviewers. Clearly, there's still a lot of participation, but I don't know if the tenure track piece is, you know, structuring it the same way. There's also been a lot of churn in the profession where people have moved to different institutions. Maybe our contact information for active reviewers has lapsed or is obsolete. People move to different industries. I'm still very attached to library publishing, even though I'm in a vendor role, but that doesn't work for everybody. Not everyone has that inclination. So there's just been a lot of change in the pools of reviewers and what our active reviewers are able to perform with their service. We're also seeing some new challenges with aligning expertise and content, especially when it comes to such an interdisciplinary field as librarianship is. Making sure that we have reviewers with the background to evaluate papers is something that we are definitely working through and, you know, trying to be very mindful of, especially when it comes to emerging topics, right? We can get a submission on the use of AI in cataloging. We can send that to our cataloger reviewers. That's great. Do they have that background in the AI piece? Who do we know that has that? So there can just be a bit of a challenge with that balancing as well. So what have we been doing? We are trying to be very proactive and dealing with these challenges in a very methodical way. One of the first things that we did when, you know, Sharon and I took on Cyril's Librarian about 6-ish years ago was take a look at the feedback prompts that reviewers were getting. Kelly showed you some great images of the guidance that the publisher provides, and TNF provides really great documentation on how to be a peer reviewer. But in terms of that communication between the publication and the prospective reviewer, we were kind of looking at that dynamic as well. When we came on board, we noticed that if you accepted an invitation to review a manuscript, you were taken to a page that had the manuscript, the anonymized manuscript, and then it had some fields to answer to give feedback to the author. And those fields were a little open-ended. And, you know, we could see on the other side, the reviews come back. And sometimes, you know, it was very detailed, very granular, line by line suggestions in some cases. And you could see the future of that paper. You see it come back with one revision and get accepted and move into pre-production versus a paper that maybe got more general comments, you know, maybe not as detailed, and maybe it took them 2 review cycles to get to an acceptance, or maybe, you know, they did one and then weren't able to follow through. So we saw this as a communication and training opportunity with our reviewers, but also as a way to provide more parity and equity for authors. We didn't want their success rate to be dependent on, you know, a reviewer not getting proper guidance. So all that is to say, we took a look at the prompts that were actually embedded within that acceptance portal. When you go to submit your review, there are more kind of tailored questions that help you think through what an author might find helpful. And I think that's been very successful. I think that has been a positive change. We're also really trying to be mindful of that bandwidth issue by load balancing our reviewer requests. We try not to overtax our active reviewers. We try to send them 2 to 3 manuscripts a year unless there's a really dire situation or someone has let us know they'd like to review more or less. We're also trying to budget more time for the peer review process. Since it's taking longer for us to identify an active and available reviewer with the relevant expertise, we want to convey the effects of that to the author so that they don't feel they're being kind of, forgotten about or that they're in limbo. We want to try to set expectations so they get good feedback, their paper is better for it, but then, we can take some of that anxiety out of the picture. It's a goal. It's a good goal. We're also embarking on some outreach to those newer to the profession to help them feel more included in the peer review process if they're interested in it. And when it comes to that alignment between content and expertise, we are incorporating calls for reviewers into the special issue calls. In particular, one, it helps us make sure that we have interested reviewers for the topic that maybe is not something that we publish a lot about on a general basis, on a typical basis. But it's also a way for us to kind of do some outreach around a topic of interest. Another small thing we're doing that I'm really excited about is in our management portal, we're trying to be more consistent about adding notes about expertise and areas of interest for the active reviewers. Kelly identified some really great benefits of being a reviewer. And I think that, something as small as noting a reviewer's areas of interest can help make this a mutually beneficial process, right? If you're interested in OER, I'm going to try not to send you papers on serials cataloging. I mean, maybe you're interested in that too. I don't want to, be presumptuous, but I want to send you papers that I think will be stimulating and interesting and provide that value to you as a reviewer. Then the author gets great feedback, the paper is successful, confetti rains from the sky, it's an all boats rise kind of thing that we're trying to achieve. Speaking of visions, our goal here, we don't want to burn out our peer reviewers. We want to get great feedback to our authors, and we want to publish as much quality, trustworthy content as we can. And we have more work to do on that front, just to be perfectly honest with you. It's something that's an ongoing endeavor. So what's next? What are we looking to in the road ahead? Further refinement of our peer reviewer prompts, definitely something we want to tighten up to create even more support, maybe hover text or tooltips to provide some additional context if needed. Sharing those broader calls, a more kind of general invitation to be a reviewer if you're interested, just to kind of demystify that process. Along the same vein, we plan to have information sessions and drop-ins for prospective reviewers. Again, to make it less of a black box, more transparent, more accessible and inviting for people who may be interested. And also, cultivate more dynamic engagement with our editorial boards. That's a piece of this too. We have some kind of existential questions that I think we're going to have to confront, and I don't have tidy answers for these, but I do want to post them again for the sake of transparency and in case people have great ideas or suggestions or thoughts that can maybe help us address these. One question I think we need to confront is, should we tighten our desk reject criteria? With the pool of reviewers being stretched as it is, with us needing to send as many invitations as we do to find someone who can review, is one way to conserve this precious resource, tightening desk reject criteria. I struggle with this because my philosophy is if a submission comes in and it passes our plagiarism checker and it's in scope, I want to send it out to a reviewer. I don't want to gatekeep. I don't want my kind of personal familiarity or lack thereof to determine the outcome of this manuscript. But that may also mean that I'm sending papers to reviewers that are not viable or don't actually lead to publication. should we conserve that resource in a different way? That's a big question. From a structural standpoint, how do we reconcile peer reviewer bandwidth and publishing pressures? Our reviewers have more to do in a day than ever before, but we're also under the same pressures to publish content, the same publishing timetables, the same or increasing article and page budgets. There's innate tension there. How do we make this work for everyone involved? Cognitive overload is a big part of all of these questions. Happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. But in general, I think the central issue we're dealing with is, what does sustainable peer review look like for us? It's something that benefits the publication, the author, and the reviewer. And that's something that we're working on. So I look forward to continued discussion in this area. Thank you so much for the time and the opportunity to be here. Thank you, and I will stop talking.
Perfect. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We have, I'm gonna go back and look at the chat. We had a question from Rebecca, and this is, Courtney, I think you addressed it a little bit, but for Brian, Kelly, and Courtney, if you could talk a little bit about how you recruit new peer reviewers, in particular if they haven't published before. So if someone is interested in peer reviewing, and I know, Courtney, you talked about putting out calls for reviewers, but how, I think this comment states that many people would be happy to be a reviewer but are never asked. So how do you go about, or if someone's interested in peer reviewing, how do they get on your radar?
I have one quick comment on that. Just when I had more bandwidth and less cognitive overload, I was doing a lot of more work in this space. I did get a lot of review requests sent to me, and I didn't have sometimes enough time or the right knowledge. And so I would reply to the editor and then CC one of my colleagues and say, I don't have the capacity to do this. My colleague Jens would be really great at this. And I think some of my colleagues got some review opportunities out of that. So definitely word of mouth is one way to do it.
Yeah, I think word of mouth is definitely something that we've relied on in the past, especially, you go to a conference, you have chats with people, you try to, subtly or not so subtly mention, oh yeah, we're always looking for peer reviewers. But I think, especially now, those models are not sufficient, and we need to open up the entryways into peer review. So yeah, I would say if there's a publication that you're interested in reviewing for, I can speak for my own, I can't vouch for others, but if you're interested in being a reviewer for Serials Librarian or Serials Review, we have an editorial email. Obviously you can email me if you want, but just generally speaking, you could send an inquiry email, and I think any editor would be delighted. They'll probably ask you just a couple of questions about your background, because the peer review process is also one that we want to ensure has a lot of integrity with it. There have been breaches of integrity with peer review. So if it's not someone that you've met before, they may ask you just a couple of questions. And our process with the special issues in particular has been to just create a form, and that identifies some key areas that we find helpful. We follow up, we make sure it's a real person, we do a little background check, something light, and then we will send you as many papers as you would like to look at. So that's I think kind of the area we're moving in. But the networking, I think, was a really big part of it when we did more in-person collaboration, when we did more in-person conferencing, and it was a big part of that trust equation and making sure there was good kind of integrity built into the process.
Matthew Giampola, and I apologize, Matthew, if I butchered your last name, but I think it's Giampaola, perhaps. So Matthew Giampaola comments that they have created, and I'm not sure who he works with, but he has created a framework for reviewers to mentor a student or a postdoc and have them help with review, and then that they have that new name of a student or a postdoc, somebody who's coming up in the field as a future potential reviewer. So they work with a current peer reviewer to write, like, I guess, co-write a review. So that's a potential thing. The other thing that I would say from my own experience as writing peer reviews is that I'm always really clear with the editor about what my areas of expertise are. So not just my interest, but to say, this is what I can speak to. And if there's a piece of the article that is outside of my scope or outside of my knowledge, I'm really clear on that. And I try, there's usually a way in writing a peer review to leave comments just for the author, but also just for the editor. So to say to the editor, like, listen, I can talk about this, but when it comes to this piece, you need to find someone else. So you don't need to feel like when you're writing a peer review that you need to be completely comfortable with the whole thing. To clearly define your own capabilities as a reviewer helps both you and the editors, I think. Heather Staines comments that some publishers are partnering with societies and sending out notices to society members, inviting them to peer review. So in particular, if you're part of a scholarly society, that's an avenue towards finding peer reviews. So Bill Kasdorf asks the question, do you ever find that peer reviewers have an agenda, so to speak, so that they are less objective than they should be? How might you recognize and deal with that?
So yeah, that is definitely something that we try to monitor as closely as possible. We do have double anonymized reviews, so we would hope that there's no kind of personal biases creeping into the process. But you know, as editors, we also look at the feedback. We don't just send it to the authors. The interaction axes that yours talked about is reviewer to editor. So we take a look and see if the comments seem fair. If it feels like, and this is subjective, right? Like these are people reflecting on other people. You know, if something doesn't feel fair or something seems overly critical, you know, like, oh, they misspelled a word, why did you berate them, right? Like something that just seems kind of out of the bounds. You know, well, we might reach out to the reviewer, or we might just, I've excerpted parts of the review that I felt were helpful, and then reached out to the reviewer and been like, you know, hey, did you have some concerns about this? I just want to touch base. And you know, maybe they were having an off day, or maybe I kind of misread the tone. It's hard with mediated discourse, but it is something as an editor that we want to be mindful of. We want this to be productive criticism, and we don't want people to feel like they're being pressured out of publishing by a negative experience or something that feels brusque or unwelcoming. We want people to feel like they have a voice and that the reviewer's interest is in expressing that voice more successfully. That's our goal.
If I can maybe comment on it, there's also the coming back to fraud and paper mills. Come back to the first presentation. There is of course the risk of manipulation. So authors recommending reviewers then doing a favor for the author, or even the reviewer names or the reviewer identity not corresponding with the email address. So basically you're thinking you're receiving an email review from the author, but it's sometimes even the author himself. So in terms of research integrity and screening for manuscripts, the review process is also very important, because a lot of the manipulation takes place on the level of review.
So Joris, do you want to, since you have the mic, do you want to ask your question about geographical disbalance?
Yeah, I just wanted, again, when I was doing innovation and peer review a few years ago at Elsevier, I know we had big discussions about the disparity in the number of authors from China and other upcoming countries versus the reviewers. It was a huge problem. So again, 80% of the authors might be from more established countries, but then the 80% of the reviewers came from these countries, but then 80% of the authors came from upcoming countries, and there is a disbalance there. I just wondered if the other panelists or people in the call have experience with that and how to solve that, because that is of course a huge potential for in terms of reviewer pool.
I can speak a little to that because I just have a memory of reviewing a paper that was clearly written by a non-native English speaker. And I really had to be careful not to like let my bias creep in and like really like focus on what they were trying to say and leave the like grammatical stuff out. So that, yeah, that's something that I think you have to be really cognizant of when you're reviewing.
Yeah, and that touches on an area that it didn't make it on the slide, but it's definitely something that we're evaluating. You know, guidance to reviewers about language. You know, we don't want to be perpetuating linguistic hegemony. We don't want to be kind of inadvertently saying there's one kind of voice that we want to see published. But we also want to make sure that the information we're sharing is comprehensible, that people can understand what's being said. So, you know, that's an area where we definitely want to do some more work to support our reviewers. I haven't seen the level of imbalance that that you described, but it's definitely something that I'll take back to our editor-in-chief to think about, because, you know, we are international publications. We have international authors, we have international reviewers, but we want to make sure that we don't end up with any kind of exploitative dynamics. And we want to support our reviewers to be focused on, you know, could I understand this? Is this useful? As opposed to maybe getting, you know, as would be easy to do, you know, not judgmental, but say like, oh, this is written in a way maybe I wasn't expecting, that kind of thing.
Matthew comments, Matthew Giampalic, and he's at the American Geophysical Union. And he comments that they have, that they also see an imbalance with authors in China being their biggest group of submitters, but their smallest person, but a small percentage, I won't say smallest, but small percentage of reviewers, and they have consciously added more reviewers in China to close that gap. One of that, I will say, I have been, I think it comes from that cognitive overload where I was at one point reviewing a book. So I was reviewing not just a single article, but multiple chapters. And I definitely got to a point where I was starting to make what I'll call really nitpicky comments about things like spelling. And there was one in particular about commas. So one of the things I've started doing as a reviewer is that once I'm done with the review, I let it sit for at least 2 days. So I give myself 48 hours to kind of take a break from it. And then I come back and reread it to make sure that the comments I have made accurately, like, really reflect what it is I would want to communicate. And also to always keep in mind that to read it and say, if I got this review, if I had submitted something and I got this review, would it be helpful to me? And would it kind of meet my needs as an author? Heather made a comment, Heather Staines made a comment about that she finds that when there is a structure to the reviewer form, so some kind of rubric, it is much easier for her to hit on the relevant aspects of what an editor is looking for. So if the editor might provide some kind of structure or form exactly the things they want, that's helpful for her. Okay, any other comments, questions for any of our presenters here? I'm kind of watching chat. So Heather, I've done the same thing. Heather comments that if she doesn't have something, it sits in her Google Docs and she worries that she's missed something. So having some kind of rubric is very helpful for her. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joris, Courtney, and Kelly. I really appreciate everybody joining us. We are headed to our lunch break. So lunch runs from noon Eastern to 1 p.m. Eastern. So we will be back here at 1 o'clock. You are all welcome and invited. I hope to see you all after lunch. And after lunch, we'll be doing a lightning session, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that when I come back, when we come back. So I look forward to seeing you all. Everybody enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you in an hour. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.